Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I'm a subscriber to Smithsonian Magazine. Each month, it is chock full of interesting articles about things I would never have thought to explore and learn about. Not too long ago, maybe about a year or so, there was a long article about figs and fig trees. I was surprised to learn that there is a thriving industry in figs, and even more in the competition to find new figs and heirloom figs. There seems to be an endless variety of flavors in figs, depending on what trees have been put together to create that particular fig tree. I could understand that, and that farmers were constantly trying new cultivars to see what they could come up with. What surprised me most was that there are people who search the woods for fig trees that have been overlooked, hoping to find a fig tree that hasn't been mixed with anything else, and so is an heirloom tree with figs as they originally were. If they find one, then they don't tell anybody and try to keep it secret until they can either purchase the land or steal a branch and root it to grow themselves. If they find one, they most often don't tell the person who owns the land and sneak onto the property and steal their cuttings. Well, I didn't know any of that. This week, as we exult in the trees around us, putting on their leaves and knowing that it is a likely sign that the cold is over and spring is here to stay, we are looking at a few of the many trees that are specifically mentioned in the Bible. We are learning about the Bible's stories, but also how the nature of the tree speaks to faith in us. Today, our focus is on the fig tree. Now, fig trees are mentioned over and over in the Bible. If there's a thriving fig tree fan base now, there certainly was in the Bible times. Let me run through just some of the many references to fig trees in the Bible. When Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil, as soon as they did it, they felt exposed in their disobedience. Like us, they wanted to cover it up, and so they did it the only way they knew how. They sewed leaves together to cover their naked exposure before God. The leaves they used were from the fig tree. The prophets Hosea, Joel, Micah, and Zechariah all talk about fig trees, most often as an example of God's faithfulness in providing and caring for God's people. It's easy to think of the sweetness of the fig as something like a dessert in that time, a special blessing of God's love and grace. When Jesus called his disciple Nathanael to follow him, he found Nathanael sitting under a fig tree. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus used a fig tree as a basis for two parables. In chapter 13, he tells of a fig tree that wasn't producing fruit, and so the owner wanted to cut it down. The gardener, however, convinced him to give it another year, and this parable is often understood as a comparison to God's patient grace with us. And then in chapter 21, Jesus speaks of a fig tree and how when the leaves come out, we know that summer is soon to come. And just so, we should be able to discern the times and the actions of God around us, marking the change of the times to the new age in Jesus. Perhaps one of the most significant times a fig tree is mentioned happens during Holy Week. Throughout that week, Jesus and his disciples are coming and going to Jerusalem from the nearby town of Bethany. And once, Jesus comes on a fig tree that is in full leaf and which looks healthy, but it has no figs. Jesus curses the fig tree, and on their way back to Bethany, the disciples notice that the fig tree has withered. We struggle to understand this action by Jesus. It seems so un-Jesus-like to curse this tree because it didn't have figs to satisfy his hunger. Well, you're right. That is un-Jesus-like. The good news is that isn't what is happening in this story. You see, the cursing of the fig tree is a symbolic action that Jesus does with a larger point. The tree was on a mountain overlooking Jerusalem, and as you looked across the valley, you could see the temple with all its activity. To the outside eye, like the fig tree, it looked like it is supposed to. But Jesus knew that it was a facade, that the worship going on there was often empty lip service, and that what was happening there was missing the very real new thing God was doing in him. So in other words, the temple looked good to the eye, but wasn't producing fruit for God. The fig tree, likewise, looked good to the eye, as if there should be figs on it, but it too wasn't bearing fruit. So Jesus was drawing a parallel between the two. Both looked as if they were thriving. Both were barren. And as the fig tree withered, so too would the temple. God was happening in Jesus. There's a whole culture of folks looking for fig trees bearing fruit. That's what God is looking for in us. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.